would you assess the current state of Holocaust institution in American educational institutions? I know it's a broad question.
Well, let's begin with the most important meaning of all at this moment. We are at a transitional moment in time. And that is, we are moving from lived memory to historical memory. We all know that the survivors who were the bearers of living memory are diminishing every day. And even those who were not losing are growing older and consequently less capable of being the visible incarnations of their own experience. What's replacing them then is, number one, they have left the most incredible record of historical testimony ever experienced in any event in human history. Let me give you one simple illustration. There are 36 audio recordings of people who lived through slavery in the Library of Congress of the United States. 36 Americans have tape recorded their experience, or been recorded with their experience of what it was like to be a slave. We probably have in excess of 80 or 90,000 video testimonies of survivors telling their story, which means that you don't have the capacity any longer merely for an elite history told by people who have memoirs and wrote books and wrote letters and diaries and all of that. But you can hear from everybody, from a professor to a peddler, from a baker to a banker, from an industrialist and a scientist to a common laborer, all of whom lived through, ordinary people who lived through the most extraordinary events and bore witness to what they experienced. That will be a historical record of enormous magnitude, and part of what we have to do is to mine that material to be able to continue their message and teach the lessons and also the history that they have taught us. So we're all at a very important transitional moment in time. And let me use a biblical analogy, which is that the story in the book of Breshit, in the book of Genesis, is that Lot, his wife and two daughters, escaped from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot's wife looked back and she turned into a pillar of salt. Lot's daughters thought that they were the last two women on earth. They thought their father was the last man on earth. They got him drunk, they seduced him, and they gave birth to two great nations. And what's remarkable is the Torah comments on that without evaluating what essentially we would have to call incest. I look at that story and I say, if you look back too soon, Lot's wife, you're paralyzed by grief. What you have to get on with is the difficult, compromised notion of survival and recreation. But if you don't look back after that, you have no memory. And we have looked back again at that darkness, faced that darkness, looked it straight into the face and have learned from it. And then survivors transform themselves in our lifetime. And I presume you're of my generation, more or less, perhaps younger, but still of my generation. In our lifetime, we've seen them transformed from damaged goods, which was the original sense of it. And I don't mean that as a judgment on them, as a judgment of our perceptions, from damaged goods to bearers of history and witnesses. And I believe that we've done something in this last generation that is almost of biblical importance, which is that the great Jewish story of history is the story of the Exodus, story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And what did Jews do with the memory of slavery and the Exodus? is they made it into a particular story of universal implications with ethical and moral consequences. So we remember it, we retell the story, and we therefore learn how to treat the widow, the orphan, the stranger, how to return the tools of the laborer, how to have the Sabbath, how to treat those who are poor and indentured, indentured, etc., etc. We've made it into a moral statement in which we learn many, many things. And the word in memory of the Exodus from Egypt, Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, is used more and more throughout the Bible. And it's at the core of the Jewish experience. I think we have now remembered the Holocaust as an ethical and moral implication for our generation and future generations, as a call, as a warning, as a cry, as a lesson, and as a commitment, first for the Jews, but also a universal story, so that other people understand what this represents. Let me give you a personal experience. I was in Rwanda right after the genocide. I was there in part to advise on how do you bury the dead but still document the crimes so you can't have denial set in. Denial is part of all genocides, and Holocaust denial is followed by the denials of multiple genocides all over the world. So you merely have to marshal your evidence to be able to do it. What people in Rwanda wanted to hear from were survivors, which is, how do you get up the morning after? And how do you live in the land of your anguish? And how do you recreate life in the aftermath of that anguish? We just had, in fact, I spoke in Shul this past Shabbat on the name Ephraim. And what does Ephraim mean? God made me fertile in the land of my affliction. Ephrati Elokim be'eretz anyi. The land of my affliction, land of my suffering. God has made me fertile. This is part of the story that I first began to ask about what is Jewish rebirth in the aftermath of destruction. So the long thing is, we're preparing for a transition. We ironically, sadly, tragically, horrifically live in a world in which the Holocaust is becoming more important, not less important. People are using the G word, genocide, again and again. They're using crimes against humanity. One side claims that it's fighting Nazis. We also live in a world in which there's Holocaust denial, which is, again, lunacy. It's the equivalent of the Flat Earth Society. But in one sense, the people who deny the Holocaust are denying it because in some deep level they want to repeat it or they want to complete it. So the state of education is that it's been transformed into institutions. The institutions are growing and transforming themselves before our eyes. I can point to 10 different museums that have been renewed in the last 5 years. Museums in Dallas, in Houston, in Cincinnati, in St. Louis, in New York, and that's just to begin. In Melbourne, in Sydney, in Johannesburg. All of them have taken on a new mission because they understand that they've lost one of the most important focal points of their educational work, which was the experience of survivors. We also have an attempt, which is interesting and not yet fully understood as to whether it works or not, to use a very long interview of 1,000 questions for survivor and artificial intelligence in order to conduct a posthumous conversation with that survivor, asking them all sorts of questions about their life and allowing, as it were, the encounter with survivors to continue even when the survivor is no longer. How that's going to work, and we now have even virtual reality, so you can visit Auschwitz with a survivor as your guide with a series of glasses and literally feel all of the dimensions of the barracks, all of the dimensions of camps, all of the dimensions of the room in something quite incredible, and again, a one-on-one experience and encounter. So there are a variety of different ways. And look, there's been enormous intellectual productivity, enormous combing of archives, and every day we learn more. And part of what's been the sheer intellectual fascination for me is that I'm never bored in what I study. Even this year, let me give you an example. A brand new series of archives have become open. Israel had honor trials in the late 1940s and 1950s of people whom had been accused of collaborating with the Nazis. Let's assume you saw somebody who had been a capo and he had been part of, God forbid, murdering your father or your child. You brought them to trial in Israel. Those records were sealed for 70 years. The 70 years have now passed, and we now can understand how Jews judge Jews for their behavior, which may or may not have been collaborative, but may have been costly of Jewish lives. So this is a whole new field about the victims victimizing each other. And that, by the way, is not to say the Jews did it. It's the Nazis and their collaborators and their enablers at the like. But we're also asking the question, if you teach in my field now, students ask a question that they weren't asking 20 years ago. How does a democratic government become authoritarian and become totalitarian? Now, sadly, that's a question we can ask today. 30 years ago, we were marveling when we found authoritarian governments becoming democratic. And in fact, I'll digress for a moment. A woman whose name you may remember, Jean Kirkpatrick, UN representative under the Reagan administration, got a reputation when said we have to cooperate, America has to cooperate with totalitarian rulers, with authoritarian rulers, because they may eventually become democratic leaders and lead their countries to become democracies. But authoritarian rulers, that's a no, no, no. The end of that decade, she wrote that article at the beginning of 1980. By the end of that decade, authoritarian rulers were becoming heads of participants or have been overthrown, and the countries were becoming democratic. And we're now seeing, sadly, tragically, painfully, the reversal of that process in which democratic leaders are becoming authoritarian and, God forbid, totalitarian. So we ask different questions of the same material. And part of the intellectual fascination of the Holocaust is that it has massive implications. History of at least 23 different countries in terms of participation. Two great monotheistic religions, Judaism and Christianity. The power of government, the nature, look, we've only this year experienced the power of resistance in the form of Zelensky, who said, don't send me a ride, give me ammunition. And we've seen resistance, right? And we just finished the few against the mighty. Who could have imagined that the Ukraine, and by the way, and Jews have a peculiar feeling we couldn't imagine ourselves rooting for Ukraine, given its historical record vis-a-vis the Jews, but the few against the mighty. The Ukraine would be able to resist Soviet aggression. Nobody imagined that was possible. The war would last a week, a month. Now we're what? We're in our 10th month, in our 11th month of this war, all because of the power of resistance. Therefore, we understand the power of resistance in a new way.